Just before I start, I wanted to make sure I acknowledge other people that worked on this report that was just released a little while ago. Manisha Pawa, Ella Ritz, Daniel Song, Shelley Harris, Stephanie Young, Elisa Candido, and Alice Peter. Alice Peter's unit on prevention at Cancer Care Ontario actually put out this report, although we were largely responsible for the content. This is the report that came out several weeks ago. I had hoped to have a printed copy to kind of wave in front of you, but of course, we put it out in time, but we did not, the printer did not. So it doesn't really matter. If you want it, it's available online, and I'll give you a URL at the end of this, talk. Oh, you have a print? Yes. You can print your own copy and go to the website. Indeed, it is out, and the full thing is available. So the primary objective of this was to identify what we believe are the most important carcinogens, both in terms of how many cancers are currently being caused by past exposures, and then also how many people are currently exposed, and then to also propose prevention measures that could be taken, focusing primarily on policy-oriented prevention measures, but also trying, when we can, to identify workplace measures as well. And most of these can be tackled at the workplace. Although we focused on well-established carcinogens, we've also tried to identify some up-and-coming issues with this. Now, many of the results here, and the reason we use the term burden in the title, is because we have a large project that has just culminated or finished on the burden of occupational cancer in Canada. This was a national team of people with folks from not only Ontario, Quebec, and British Columbia. And so we have been very busy over the last 4 years trying to estimate the numbers of cancers that are due to well-established workplace carcinogens. And this work was funded by the Canadian Cancer Society and was meant really to give us kind of a comprehensive review or a comprehensive overview of how important workplace carcinogens are. This is a national project, a national team grant, so I did want to acknowledge lots of people have worked on this, not only at our center, but in other places. Also, the Institute for Work and Health, Emil Tampa led a team that was looking at the economic aspects of this, that they're still working on that, but they put out a paper on the cost of asbestos-related cancers that's received a lot of attention, probably more attention internationally than necessarily here in Ontario, but I think it's an important paper. A lot of the data that we present also here is from the Carex Canada project, which is a project that I started many years ago when I was back at the University of British Columbia, and I still am involved with, that has the objective of trying to identify the number of occupational and environmental cancers or people exposed to cancer across the country. It's again, a very large project. It's funded by the Canadian Partnership Against Cancer, but it's not been going for a number of years. The value of this is really that although we have tried to point out the number of cancers that are currently happening, really that's really due to what I would call sins of the past. The fact that we didn't prevent exposure historically, but we really have to be thinking about what we can do now to prevent exposure going forward. And then I wanted to acknowledge, before I get into the results of this project, that we did have a policy advisory team, we did have reviewers, and they contributed a whole lot to this project in terms of trying to review the different policy recommendations, review how we were looking overall at these issues. And so they did volunteer a lot of time for us. Several folks are here today, and so they really did do quite a bit for us. And they're certainly listed in the report if people want to see who all was involved Lots of people were involved. Now, this report focuses in terms of the burden of cancer, on very well-established carcinogens, things that we, for the most part, have known cause cancer in the workplace, mostly for decades. A few recently identified, but a lot of these we certainly have known about for a very long time. And we relied upon the International Agency for Research on Cancer's evaluations of this. IARC is and remains the most well recognized and used source for identifying what does cause cancer internationally. I'd like to point out to people that years ago, even many years ago, when I was relatively young, so that was quite some time ago, when I was at IARC, when an IARC monograph came out and said that something caused cancer, at that point they had done a survey. 127 countries had a regulatory response to that they reviewed it, they actually looked at those things, it would actually cause them to reconsider what their regulations were and how they dealt with carcinogens. So these evaluations remain very important. They're publicly available on the web if anybody ever wants to look at these. And they're almost encyclopedia style in terms of the amount of information that is there. So this is kind of the bottom line summary in terms of the number of cancers caused and the number of people that we estimate are still currently exposed to. It's about the top 12 or 13, mostly well-established in carcinogens, but also a few suspected ones at the bottom. Ones that actually have evidence but have not been classified as what we call group 1 carcinogens. But what you see here is thousands, and certainly 3,000 or 4,000 or so annually cancers caused by exposure to workplace carcinogens. The top of our list is solar UV with asbestos, diesel exhaust, crystalline silica all involved. These are all ones that have also been identified as part of the occupational disease strategy as being very important here in Ontario, so they're certainly well recognized. So the first column lists the carcinogens, the second one lists the annual numbers of cancers, and the third is the current exposure. The reason I have parentheses around some of these are the less well-established associations. They're ones for which there is evidence, but they have not yet reached the point where IARC, which some people might call, have been, I guess, labeled as being a bit radical in their evaluations. It's actually a very conservative group in terms of the amount of evidence that has to be there before something really gets called an established workplace carcinogen. So you see that for diesel exhaust, for instance, we have 170 lung cancers annually. And there's probably an additional 45 bladder cancers based upon the current evidence that we have. And then you see shift work at the bottom as a potential important cause of breast cancer in women, and it's being investigated for other cancers as well. Now, this is available in the report, and I won't spend a lot of time here, but just to give you a bit of an overview. I'm not going to be talking about some of the other topics that we looked at in the report, so if you're interested, I would suggest that you go there to actually look at that. We do talk about a number of other issues. For some of the carcinogens we looked at, they didn't meet our criteria for numbers of cancers being caused, but they do cause other health effects, things such as wood dust and formaldehyde, artificial UV. But also we're looking at some up-and-coming issues, or at least ones where the evidence is mounting, things like pesticides and shift work are certainly there. So solar UV, outdoor work and sun exposure at work hits the top of our list in terms of numbers of cancers caused, 1,400 each year. 450,000 people work the majority of their time outdoors here in Ontario. That's true in agriculture, it's very true in construction, also in some of our other workers, for instance, some of our public sector workers, public works people work outdoors as well. Our policy recommendation here is that that workplaces that have a large number of outdoor workers should actually develop comprehensive multi-component sun safety programs. This is something that has been, put in more firmly in places like Australia, where certainly sun is much more intense there, and they're much more advanced in their prevention measures. But this does not mean that it's not a problem here, as you can see by the number of cancers caused. So it is one of our recommendations, and we have a project that we've worked on at the Occupational Cancer Research Center, Sun Safety at Work Canada, that provides a lot of resources in that area. Our second one, which certainly results in the most fatal cancers and is going to be no surprise to anybody, is asbestos. Still, we're estimating around 50,000 people are regularly exposed to asbestos in the workplace. It's probably much larger for people who run into it on a less regular basis. There is a lot of asbestos that is out there, so that even when we go forward with our asbestos ban, hopefully early next year, we're still going to be having issues around asbestos for many years to come. We're recommending that Ontario follow the examples of the federal government and of Saskatchewan of creating a building registry that's publicly available or publicly accessible, and that really we could go further than that and include all workplaces and not just public workplaces. The other thing that we are suggesting, which is something that has been done in British Columbia, is to create a interministerial working group to deal with some of the issues that are going to arise from asbestos and continue to arise. Things like disposal, things like renovation and abatement that go beyond just the traditional jurisdiction of a single ministry. It's certainly something that we should take advantage of, having the momentum of having the ban to go forward and really push to be more comprehensive in how we deal with asbestos moving forward. Diesel engine exhaust is one of these things that is probably would be more recent in terms of our knowledge of its causing cancer. For those of us who are in cancer research, we have known about it for a number of years and have just been waiting for the evaluation, which came about 5 years ago from IARC. We have still not, I believe, caught up regulatorily on this. This is a common exposure out there. Our estimate is about 300,000 people work around diesel equipment in transportation, in construction, and in mining. And we don't currently have an occupational exposure limit outside of mining, where I don't think it's an adequate exposure limit that is really pointed at the component of diesel exhaust that causes, or that we believe causes, lung cancer, which is the fine particulates. This 20 milligrams per meter cubed, or 20 micrograms per meter cubed, which seems like a tiny amount, was a recommendation or was proposed as an ACGIH TLV a number of years ago. It was withdrawn. At the time, ACGIH was close to being sued out of existence, and was getting, and that put it in kind of a situation where they were a little bit more conservative in going forward. And the use of elemental carbon as a measure of diesel engine exhaust was much less accepted than it is today. That would certainly be pushing things in the area of mining. This is a Finnish recommendation to go with 20 for mining and 5 for everyone else. I don't think 5 is particularly onerous. And it's not particularly radical when you look at the where we estimate the increased risk of cancer is with people exposed to diesel exhaust. Certainly an action that really also needs to be taken is to replace or upgrade existing equipment, of which there is a lot out there. We are I think, naturally going through that in terms of on-road diesel equipment trucks. There are engines out there. There are a lot of them, but things are moving much faster there. And the problem is in the off-road area where there are much greater challenges. Crystalline silica is one of these things that's been around for a very long time in terms of our knowledge of its ability to cause cancer as well as lung disease. Still approximately 200 lung cancers per year annually, we're estimating here in Ontario, in mining and construction primarily, but also in mineral products manufacturing. We do recommend that we need to take more measures and really bring construction more under the standard protection that in terms of occupational exposure limits. That certainly is in progress here in Ontario. But we also need to look at our occupational exposure limits and be keeping those up to date. I know this is something that everyone is aware of, and there is action in this area to move forward. It can be challenging, but certainly for a number of years, the ACGIH has recommended a lower limit for crystalline silica. 7 provinces have changed their occupational exposure limits as well as the federal government. Welding fumes is, yes?
Can I ask you a quick question? The workers' exposures that you're listing, and then, for instance, with silica, now 200 lung cancers annually.
Mm-hmm.
Where does that 200 number come from? Is that workers that are approved for compensation? Or how do you come up with that 200?
Our Burden of Occupational Cancer project was a multi-year project to look at historical exposures to different workplace carcinogens, historical labor force data, and then to model the number of people who were exposed, their levels of exposure, and then estimate the number of cancers that were caused by those historical exposures. So it's totally independent of people being compensated. In fact, we only compensate a small number of people for lung cancer outside the area of asbestos. I could spend a whole hour on that, and I'm happy to talk about it at lunch. It is an estimate, and it's certainly much larger, but it's not based in terms of compensation. It's really based upon what we think the real number of cancers are, which is what we think should be the important numbers for promoting prevention. Thanks. I am sorry, and I apologize for going quickly here. Welding fumes were just identified or classified as a cause of lung cancer just this spring by IARC. We've known for a long time that welders have an increased risk of lung cancer. Oftentimes it was blamed upon various components. Now the focus is really on any kind of fine particles, increasing the risk of lung cancer. Our recommendation from the report is here that we introduce ventilation requirements into occupational health and safety legislation here in Ontario. This is Paul's recommendation at the bottom, which wasn't approved by any committee, but there really is, our regulation of welding has been focused in on the components of welding, such as chromium and nickel, and I think we need to really lower the overall limit for any kind of really ultrafine particles that can be breathed into the lung based upon our current science, and trying to regulate them as kind of a nuisance dust, which is sometimes done instead of focusing in or just focusing in on the subcomponents, I don't think is adequate. I think we do need to really re-examine how we regulate welding fumes. Well, environmental tobacco smoke is something that I think we've dealt with a lot here in Ontario. Still many, when you take surveys, many people do still encounter smoking at work. And we estimate that still only about 2% of the working population still regularly encounter smoking at work. These are the number of cancers just among non-smokers. So I think we still need to continue to build on our past successes and really think about how we can continue to prevent smoking at work. You know, radon is, again, an issue that's been around for a long time. We no longer have active uranium mines, but there still is radon at work. A thing that is often not recognized is we focus in on homes and radon in homes. Well, if you have a workplace that isn't ventilated with outdoor air very much, that doesn't have a lot of people going in and out, radon can actually build up in those kind of buildings as well. We're hoping to take more of a look at that here. Currently, we, oftentimes is pointed to the norm guidelines as something that could be used in workplaces, but we could move that into legislation. We could actually regulate that, I think, more strongly. Currently in Canada, we often use 200 becquerels per meter cubed as our safe level or our goal, and WHO is actually recommending 100 becquerels per meter cubed as where we should point to, and I think that that's an important target to aim for. You've noticed OELs here as something that I brought up a number of times. I don't think I need to belabor this anymore. There are some key carcinogens that we are behind on. I know we're moving forward, I believe, on chromium right now, but there's some other ones that are out there where our occupational exposure limits have, I think, not kept up with current science. And there's some proactive things we can do in terms of promoting toxics use reduction. Ontario is one of the only jurisdictions in North America and in the world that has toxics reduction legislation, but we could strengthen that legislation, and particularly it's currently held in the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, which is appropriate, but we could really focus in on it as a workplace tool and really encourage more movement away from toxic substances to less toxic substances and changes in technology proactively. One of our other general recommendations was of the value of exposure surveillance. We have an asbestos worker registry here. A challenge is we have many people who've already been exposed to these different exposures, and having these kind of registries that require that we at least record who's been exposed and think about that going forward, I think could be a powerful tool in both informing people of their potential exposures and helping people who have been exposed in the future. So with that, I think I've kept to my time and won't hold you back too much further from coffee. This is the easiest URL to get to the report. I'm happy to answer whatever questions Val tells me we have time for, or to talk to people at the break or at lunch more about this report and our results with it. So I hope I was relatively coherent in my fast talking. Thank you.